Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Namaste, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. It is a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Koenraad Elst. He is with us today. We at Agastya Gurukulam are very proud to present his views on decolonizing education. Dr. Elst needs no introduction. His work speaks for itself. He's an author of over 30 books, including such path-breaking works as Decolonizing the Hindu Mind. He has written, spoken extensively on many topics. Today, we are going to keep the discussion focused on decolonizing education, which is a topic that we believe is of critical importance to the present and future of India. So with that, the format of this webinar is going to be a Q&A, and the way we want to do it is we're going to start with a few questions to Dr. Elst. We'll work on a theme, and then we'll work our way towards the rest of the webinar. Just give me 1 second here to make sure we are recording. This mouse is not working. Okay, we are recording. Okay, so with that, let's get going. So, Dr. Elst, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure having you. Let me start with the first question. How do you define how do you define colonization? What is colonization in your mind?
Well, colonization historically, as everybody knows really, means first of all to take control of a land. Secondly, it either means to only retain control so that you can make money out of it, or to settle a population there. In India, the latter was hardly the case. There was only an exploitation of India going on, the occupation of India. And then making a large part of the Indian population part of this colonizing project, so that they became subservient to the British and helped, in fact, in whatever the British wanted to do with India.
Okay, thank you. Now, the next question was, you have written a book. So this is about colonization of a land and its people, and you rightly explained that, yes, British didn't live in India, unlike, say, Australia or the US, but they still kept India colonized. You've written a whole book called Decolonizing the Hindu Mind. Could you please explain how the Hindu mind is still colonized?
Yes.
Some would say that we got independence in 1947. How can you say that?
Well, I entirely agree. India got independence in 1947. So I find lots of people who still say, oh, but in a sense we are still colonized. Well, India is not colonized. India is decolonized. And anything that you can now complain of is your own doing. You see, you can't blame the British anymore, they have gone. And if there are still elements in Indian life today that can be identified with the British, it is because you kept it. It's not because the British are imposing it on you. Maybe they did so in the past, but that is long ago. And so now it is only there because you yourself, Indians, imposed it. I have written about decolonizing the Hindu mind because there is a big difference between Indian and Hindu in this case. You see, the Hindu mind is very much colonized. The Indian mind, well, there is first of all a big difference between the different religious groups. There is a very different sense of colonization between Hindus and Muslims. though Muslims have their own decolonization to do. Then the situation of Christians is again different. They were all along strongly identified with the colonizers. They had a privileged position during the colonial period. They have not really lost that privileged position under Nehru. And so they have their own story, but at any rate, for them, the need to decolonize is much less acute, much less urgent. I am specifically talking about the real colonized people of India, who are the Hindus. And so they mentally do have quite a bit of decolonization work to do.
Fascinating. Some people would be surprised by that. When you say Hindus in India are a colonized people, they would look at it and say Hindus run the country, they're 79% of the population. How do you say they're colonized? I mean, it is their country, they're running it, but somehow you still feel, or your observation is that they're colonized. Why would you say that?
Well, because there are very important elements in Indian public life that date back to the British that have been preserved. Some new elements are also coming in that are mostly culturally American. Again, you see it is Indians themselves who bring them in. You can't say it is colonization. Nevertheless, mentally speaking, there is still a strong element of colonization in it. Though again, you see the people responsible for the colonization are ultimately Indians themselves. But nevertheless, you can say that a number of elements still are part of the colonial heritage. This is first of all true for the English language. This is also true for the Constitution of India, which is largely a carbon copy of the Government of India Act 1935, which was part of the British system of controlling India. And so the whole orientation in education, the concepts underlying the economy and so on, it's all very much Western heritage. At this point, I am not saying whether that is good or not. I am only noticing this fact.
Okay, thank you. Now, switching to education, Dr. Elst, your book, by the way, Dr. Elst's book, Decolonizing the Hindu Mind, is an incredible work of scholarship. It's a must read, and we cannot recommend it enough. In your book, you have a whole section on Macaulayism. You speak of Macaulayism, among a number of other things, but you specifically identify that. Would you elaborate on what is Macaulayism, and then we'll jump more into the education related questions from there.
Right. So Thomas Babington Macaulay spent several years in India in about 1835. And he coined an education policy that was very English oriented. He said, and that's what he really wanted to do, he said he wanted to create a class of Indians that would mediate between the British and the common people, and that would culturally, mentally be entirely English, even though physically Indian. He did not say that this class should be there forever. He did not say that it should comprise all the Indian people. He did not want to anglicize the Indian people as a whole. He merely meant this as an instrument of civilizing the Indians, by creating a class of people that would transmit British values to the mass of the people. So, in fact, he wanted to civilize the savages, so to speak. So he needed a class, an elite class of Indians that would orient itself completely towards British culture, interiorize it, and transmit it to the rest of the population. With this, he claimed, at least he said so in his speech in Parliament, that he ultimately desired Indian independence. He wanted to bring the Indians up to the level of the British, at which time they could become independent. But now they needed some tutelage They needed to brought up to maturity with British help and with the help of this intermediate class. It is not true, I may add. You see, very many Indians still believe in a speech that he's supposed to have made in which he says, India is great, India is civilized, it's so wonderful, we have to destroy it, we have to bring it down, and therefore we have to destroy its culture. Now, if you read that speech, you can already see this is a forgery. Mm-hmm. Why? Because it is not at all in tune with colonial policies at that point in time. Mm-hmm. You see, in the 19th century, the British saw themselves as beneficial to everyone. It was, in their minds, a service to the Indians that they were at all willing to come and colonize them. Mm-hmm. And so, whether he meant it or not, at any rate, in his public formulation, very certainly Macaulay would have presented his policies as beneficial to the Indians. Mm-hmm. Whereas in this version that so many people believe, he does just the opposite. He wants to destroy Indian culture and all that. No, you see, he thought it was a good thing. Mm-hmm. And of course, he wanted to do the best for the Indians, but not for Hindu culture. Mm-hmm. On the contrary, he thought that the Indians needed to be liberated from their culture, both the Hindus and the Muslims. Right. You see, they were all backward, and so the way to come up was to outgrow their culture and to turn to British culture.
I find it fascinating you say that because Macaulay wanted on the one hand to free Indians from their culture, as you mentioned. However, I'm going to read from your book where it says the pre-Macaulayan vernacular system of education was destroyed, even though British surveys had found it more effective and more democratic than the existing education system in Britain. The so do you I this is a fascinating insight. I don't know if too many Indians themselves know about what pre-British education system in India looked like, and your observation is that it was better than the British system at that time. Would you care to elaborate? Because I think this is probably a revelation to a lot of Indians.
Yes, that is, for example, a case where Indians show a high degree of colonization till today. You see, they have interiorized the erstwhile British view that Indian culture was backward and that it needed to be uplifted. Now, in this regard, at any rate, Indian culture was about the best you could expect. And so its education system was quite effective, was quite democratic, more democratic than education in Britain at that point of time. It was very effective in the sense that whatever science was needed in Indian society at that time was available in plenty, was taught in plenty. So you could say, yeah, some modern sciences and so on were not yet there. Okay, that's partly true. Those could, of course, perfectly have been introduced. In Japan, for example, you had a radical modernization without colonization. So you don't need colonization for that. But yeah, I mean, that is how it happened. And so many Indians have interiorized the belief that they owe the British something in terms of education. The details about this are found in books by Dharampal, The Beautiful Tree, especially. The beautiful tree meant, it's an expression used by Mahatma Gandhi, where he described the pre-British Indian culture. The beautiful tree that the British destroyed. And so Dharampal goes back to how it was before. And so he gives a very glowing report where, of which much can still be seen through British surveys. You see, before they installed British education, they first wanted to see what was already available. And so it is the British themselves, from the horse's mouth, so to speak, who testified that this was in fact a very good system. Mm-hmm. But you see, it didn't serve their purpose, so they went ahead and impose British education anyway.
Mhm. And on that note, you mentioned Japan, so I'm going to read again from your book another fascinating insight. The rivaling educationist party, called the so-called Orientalists, had proposed a Sanskrit-based system of education in which Indian graduates would not have been as estranged from the mother civilization as they became through English education, and in which they could have selectively adopted the useful elements of Western modernity, more or less the way Japan modernized itself.
Yes.
So it's quite fascinating that one of the pushbacks we get a lot of times from people is, why is Sanskrit or traditional Indian mathematics, or why is that education relevant at all? If we had kept it, we would still be backward. Whereas here, you're almost making the opposite point. Would you elaborate, please?
Right. Of course, you would not have to be backward. Japan, China, and earlier also Russia, for example, have modernized through their own language. And so one effect of it is that all your own cultural references remain intact. If you study Sanskrit, almost automatically you're going to be exposed to Chanakya, to Kalidas, and so on. Those who go through English education are very much alienated from their native culture. They read Shakespeare, and there's nothing against Shakespeare, but that comes at the cost of reading Kalidas. And so that's a big difference. And so the Orientalizers, they thought, well, it is perfectly possible to transmit that which is valuable in English culture through the native languages.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be done, and that has been done in other countries. Now, their ultimate goal was quite similar to Macaulay's, in the sense that they also believed you should civilize the savages, you should transmit to them modern British values. Nevertheless, their opinion of native culture was not as negative as Macaulay's.
Okay. And that's a great link, though. I mean, alienation from mother culture, and as a part of the overall colonization idea, and the alienation of one's culture. And again, I'm going to read from your book, Dr. Elst, where you have an observation from Ashish Nandi, and I'm going to read verbatim. Schooling is the chosen instrument of alienation. The brightest children are snatched away from familiar surroundings to be introduced in schools based on the Western model. When they leave, they speak the language of the colonizer and can no longer communicate with their own people. Now, this is an amazing insight, and living here in North America, we have seen that implemented through the native residential school system, which was an incredible story of colonization through almost, some would argue, a cultural destruction of an entire population.
Yes.
Uh, and these issues are alive and with us today. Even today in Canada, for example, the government appointed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to look into this, and specifically the role of the church, the Christian church, as an instrument of the government to essentially, remove an entire generation of natives from their culture through the residential school system, where hundreds or thousands of them were abused, taken away from their family, and done that. So, but even when that is not the case, you still see that education as a way of alienation from civilization, yes, and therefore as a means of colonization.
Yes, I was in Phoenix, Arizona last week, and so I don't know much about America. I'm not very familiar with society here, but there I had the opportunity to go to the Native American Museum, the Heard Museum, and where there was a big exhibition specifically about these residential schools. So I was rather appalled how bad it was. I mean, I know it existed, but I didn't know it was that bad. And so there they really wanted to take away Indians completely from their native culture, make them actually forget their language, make them miss all the rituals pertaining to their worldview, puberty rituals, and so on. And so cutting them off completely, making them Christians, making them American citizens. In a few cases, Indians witness that they came through this system more or less unscathed, in fact, even more loyal to their native culture. But among many, it has worked to quite a degree. Now, the Macaulayan system is, of course, not as thorough. They didn't take people away entirely from their surroundings, and then a very large part of the surroundings remained untouched. India was just simply too large to take on that way. But yes, essentially it is the same sort of project.
Yeah, Dr. Elsa, I find it fascinating because even today, when we were growing up, I know of people who went to convent schools. So, for example, English medium schools. I do know that there are schools in which the kids would be fined if they spoke their
Yes.
local language, if they spoke in their mother tongue. In school, they're imposing speaking only in English. So, I mean, it is quite fascinating. So that leads me to my next question, which is: do you consider the current Indian education system to be colonized? And if so, how?
Well, yes, I mean, contents-wise, it is certainly very different from traditional India. And first of all, of course, the whole elite education in ever larger numbers is through English medium. And then contents-wise, it is also full of Western references, anciently Christian, now perhaps less and less so, still to a large extent. But now you have this, let's say, this social justice warrior element coming in, feminism, those values are very much promoted through the education system. And so, by contrast, pupils are taught to look down on Hindu culture. Like Christian schools, for example, unlike here among the Native Americans, did not automatically impose Christianity. You see, that would have provoked too much resistance. But what they do instill in pupils is a certain alienation from and even contempt for Hindu civilization. And so that, I think, is very much, that can be called colonization, even though there is no colonizer anymore.
Hmm. And it's simply fascinating. I mean, if you look at any country around the world, is there any example where an entire education system is still taught in the language of the colonizers? The elite class speaks the language of the colonizers, the former colonizers, and it's educated by institutions of a religion that are not their native religion institutions. Is there any example of this anywhere in the world?
Well, in terms of language, of course, there certainly is. Most of Africa uses either Arabic, even in countries where the people do not speak Arabic amongst each other, or in the colonial languages, Portuguese, French, or English. Now, there you see that is a little bit more understandable. They have no literary tradition. Often the languages are very small, making it difficult to produce textbooks in their own language, to get them published profitably, thinking of the needs of the publishers. And so also there it is very difficult. Those countries traditionally are also quite poor and so on. So this takes a great effort, though I think they should also do the effort ultimately. But in the case of India, or let's also compare with Latin America, there, of course, the native languages are not dead. I mean, in the cities and so on, people speak Spanish, but you have still large areas where they speak Guarani or Quechua or so. And so, to an extent, there also you have the same situation. They go to school in Spanish. At home, they speak their mother tongue. There, I must say, in Bolivia, for example, you have quite a revival of native culture. So there you have a move to decolonize education. There's not in every country like that, but it exists here and there. Now, in the case of India, there you do not have these practical problems that you have in Africa. You do have a literary tradition. It is all right there. These are very large language groups where you can profitably publish. You have many people capable of making translations and so on. So in India, it is only a matter of political will. You just have to take the decision. We're going to do this in our own language, and it can be done.
Thank you. I'm going to end this section on colonization with a fascinating insight. And this, everybody who's listening, this is a sentence for the ages I found in Dr. Elst's book. So listen to it carefully, people. Here it goes. Applied Macaulayism is often called Nehruvian Secularism.
Exactly.
That is a mind-blowing statement and an amazing insight. I don't think anybody can say it better than that. So let's end it with that sentence, which I'm going to repeat one more time. Applied Macaulayism is often called Nehruvian secularism. So thank you. There was a good discussion on colonization per se. So now let's move on to the section about, okay, so what? Why decolonize? So a question, let me start with this. Why should we care to decolonize the Indian mind? Some may argue that the status quo is working well, India is progressing economically, and Indians are successful because of their education system and proficiency in English. How do you respond?
Well, I would say that countries like Nigeria, for example, we have education entirely through English, more thoroughly than India. Yet, I wouldn't call it an economic success story, not like India is at the moment. And or countries like Zimbabwe, for example, that are really bad basket cases. They are English language. So that is not the reason. By contrast, China, for example, has never been tempted by switching over to English. Indeed, there are Chinese scientists who do Nobel level research work who don't even know English. Now that I don't advise. I think it's useful to learn an international communication language, but nevertheless, it is not true that knowing English is necessary. And to the extent that I, of course, advise people to know some English anyway, I nevertheless want to emphasize that teaching through English medium is not necessary at all. In Germany, in Russia, in Japan, and so on, they all learn science through their mother tongue. Then later, like in the advanced, doctoral years of university, there they may have a foreign guest professor teaching in English, but otherwise they have their whole education in their mother tongue. So there is no need at all to keep that from Indians. You see, in universities, often you have the humanities available in the mother tongue, but the science departments entirely in English. That is not necessary at all. Of course, it is helpful to know English to keep up with the international literature in your field, but you learn that as a second language.
Correct. So then the answer would be that it's not English that necessarily explains the success of Indians. It is something else. And even without English, in fact, you may be even more successful if you had kept your education system rooted in the culture and local languages.
Exactly. That is why I was very pleasantly surprised when the first policy act of Yogi Adityanath, the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, was to bring in English as a second language in the Hindi medium schools. You see, this was protested against by some Hindi wallahs saying, oh, you see, this is another kowtow to the dominance of English. No, it is just the opposite. It was a way to save vernacular education. Many parents are convinced that their child needs to know English because they look around them and they see, as Madhu Kishwar has observed, that default line in Indian society or on the Indian labor market is not what religion or what caste you are, it is whether you know English or not.
Mm-hmm.
So they want their child to know English even though it's going to a Hindi medium school. Well, that is possible, that is perfectly possible, provided you make sure that there is a good second language course of English.
Mm-hmm.
So then you have the normal situation that you have in Germany, in Brazil, in Mexico, and so on, where they learn a second language thoroughly, where they come out of school at 17, 18, and they know this language. They can take courses or they can even go abroad and study in English.
Mhm.
So they know it well enough, but nevertheless, their medium of instruction remains their mother tongue.
Okay, thank you. I think you already briefly touched upon this. Just checking in case there's anything else. The question here was, what can India learn from other leading civilizations to educate its people? I think you already touched upon that.
Yes.
Anything else you'd like to add?
Well, there are experiments of different kinds, like in Germany, the Steiner schools, the Montessori schools, Paulo Freire from Brazil, and so on. Many people have thought about education and who wanted to do something about uh, the um, the emphasis that is laid on purely economically useful skills that are developed in schools, that want to emphasize more the whole person, the artistic skills and so on, for which they often go back to the traditional education that existed in their country before the modern age. So that is a large part of what India has to do as well. And so schools now are very unilaterally oriented to cognitive skills. And so the rest has to, and for that, you see, India goes quite far, like China, like Japan. Their schooling is very persistent, is very tough. Compared to that, in the West is very lackadaisical. But nevertheless, it is very one-sided. So if you go back to traditional schooling, you get more holistic forms of teaching. And so those, of course, that is another aspect you see where education has to be decolonized.
Okay, thank you. Uh, so then, on this theme of why decolonize, what would you say to parents in India or parents of people of Indian origin who have children studying in North America or other parts of the world? What are the consequences of the current education that they're being given? That is pretty much, if it's in India, it's alienated from its native culture, and if they're growing up in the West, they're essentially getting a Western sort of view of Indian culture, which is often not quite representative or even positive. I mean, I think people have spoken about the Western view of Hinduism or India as, at least the way it is presented in textbooks, is to reduce it down to the caste curry cow stereotypes. So, what do you say to the parents of those kids about the consequences of their children being educated here, either in North America through that kind of a view, or as it is being presented in India through the regular English medium, Christian school, a lot
Right.
of Christians, convent schools, as they say in India.
Well, in America, the whole idea of wanting to Christianize and Americanize the Native Americans, that has been given up.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the contrary, there is a certain premium on non-Western forms of education, skills, and so in that atmosphere, you would expect that Hinduism would also be seen very positively. Now, that is not the case. On the contrary, I can't think of any culture at the moment that is treated more negatively than Hinduism. And that has to do not with the old Christian drive against idolatry, as it was called. You see, that it's still there. There are still missionaries and so on. But now, from an official American viewpoint, there's something else that plays. Namely, they have this emphasis on egalitarianism and this historical need to exorcise their own history of racial slavery. Now, all those elements, inegalitarian, racial, slavery, they all come together in the Western understanding of the caste system. And so other cultures are simply different cultures, whereas Indian culture, or specifically Hindu culture, is seen as the carrier of those same values that we in the West have had a hard time getting rid of, and that now we have a duty to help in eliminating wherever they exist, which is primarily in Hinduism. And so there is a very strong anti-Hindu climate here, where you would expect that as a foreign culture, as an exotic culture, it would, on the contrary, be very popular.
What you describe sounds like a civilizing mission 2.0 in a new bottle.
Well,
almost.
exactly. You see, in the old days, the benighted heathens had to be liberated from Satan. And now, you see, the oppressed people of India have to be liberated from this ugly, vicious, inegalitarian, racist caste system.
Yeah. What I find fascinating is that is absolutely the diametrical opposite of how practicing Hindus like ourselves view ourselves. Uh, but anyway, let's not stray off topic. What I did want to say though is let's push that topic a little bit further when you say egalitarianism. So it is almost sounds like this is a deconstructionist view of Hinduism coming more from the left, not so much from the right.
Mhm.
Would you elaborate, or what do you think of that?
Well, the identification of Hinduism with caste is pretty much across the political spectrum. What little remains of the extreme racist right among whites is very serious about the Aryan invasion theory, in which they believe. And so what they know of India is usually very little. What they do know of India is that the caste system is a racial apartheid system, by which the white Aryan invaders tried to preserve their racial purity against mixing with the dark aboriginals.
Okay.
So that gives you an idea of what the Aryan invasion theory has done to India in the past. Now that past mentality is very much in retreat among whites, but it has been taken over by the left and by the Indian Ambedkarite movement, especially by the low castes, who have interiorized this idea that the high castes are foreigners, they are oppressing us, we have to fight them. And so there you get this division in society in India, all on the basis of that same theory. So it is propounded both by the right and by the left. Also, Christians, for example, strongly have this idea that there is something very inhuman about Hindu culture. Like what they also bring in is the theory of karma. They say, you see, karma justifies, of course, caste inequality. If you have lived in a wrong way in your past life, you are punished with the birth in a low caste. And other misfortunes may also be explained in this way. Like you have, for instance, Jesus gets the question from his apostles: if someone is born blind, are his parents to blame that they are punished with having a blind child, or is he himself to blame? Which presupposes that he had a past life in which he could have committed the sins that now are being punished. So Jesus says neither. Some people have a misfortune, have a handicap, and so on, only to make it possible for God to show his might, namely, and there he is referring to the miracles that he himself is supposed to be doing. Now, at any rate, it follows that Christianity clearly breaks with all ideas of karma. And so there again, you see, they see Hinduism through this lens. Hinduism has this evil element of blaming victims for their own misfortune. So again, you see, this is part of the demonizing view of Hinduism.
Clear. Absolutely. And clearly these are distortions which any practicing Hindu or anybody who understands Hinduism from the inside would
Mhm.
strongly argue against, but that viewpoint is not presented in the education system. So the children who are going through the education system here, they are going to interiorize this negative, sort of alienated,
Yeah.
external viewpoint that's coming from the lens that's not their own.
Right. There was the famous California textbook affair in 2005, where it was found by the Hindu parents involved that they themselves had no say in how their religion was presented in the textbooks,
Hmm.
whereas, yeah, first the Christian and the Jewish lobbies, more and more the Islamic lobby, managed, of course, to like weed out all negative references,
Hmm.
references to, for instance, slavery in Islam, and that by contrast, Hindus were given the full force of negative prejudices, which perhaps in the 19th century would have been understandable, which by now really should have been improved upon, corrected. And so there you see the Hindus lost completely.
Hmm.
There you see the anti-Hindu version won all the way. Now I have to add that 10 years later, the same textbooks came up for review, and there Hindus started a little bit having an influence. Like, for instance, they managed to prevent the proposed replacement of any reference to India with South Asia.
Hmm.
Which I mean, from a Western viewpoint, is also very much meant to humiliate
Hmm.
Indians, to say, but India doesn't even exist.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So, I mean, to be clear, a lot of the negative views remain in the textbooks in the United States
Yes,
today,
absolutely.
and this is what children of people of Indian origin living here are studying about their own culture in school. So, at home, if they're Hindu parents, they're trying to raise the children in Hindu ways. At school, they're being told that you're part of this
Hmm.
evil, ridiculous, terrible, terrible
Yes,
religion that you should have nothing to do with.
right. In India, at least, Hinduism is in the air, even if they don't teach it in school, and in state-sponsored schools, they don't teach Hinduism.
Hmm.
But so even if they don't teach it, you get references to Hindu culture all the time from your surroundings. In America, that is not the case at all.
Right.
So there, I am afraid that if you want to transmit Hindu culture, you are very dependent on creating your own structures, have a sort of Sunday school in local temples or so, and do a lot at home. Do
Mhm.
your bhajans and so on at home.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. And Agastya Gurukulam, we are trying to do that. That's part of that. But I think let's push on this topic a little bit more because, again, a lot of people ask us, even when we look at Agastya Gurukulam's program, why do we care about teaching this stuff? And our response to them a lot of times is kids who are getting this negative view from the school, their surroundings, other places where these conversations are being held, they seem to lose self-confidence. They seem to develop a sense of almost a sort of negative view of themselves, and they see themselves as not quite as equal to their peers from other cultures or races. And it's nothing to do with socioeconomic status. I mean, many of these people come from highly affluent families, but still socially they feel a negative influence on their psyche. uh, would you have you seen any?
Well,
What's your
one
comments on
one
that?
thing that many young Hindus do is simply to quit Hinduism, not necessarily by formally converting to anything else, but to just withdraw from Hindu life. And so in India itself too, you see people say, we don't want this whole identity business, Hindu or whatever. We are who we are, and we are happy like this. And if the government policy regarding culture and so on changes, we'll go along, or if it changes the other way, it's just not our business as long as we can make money, survive and so on, is good enough. Now, yes, it is quite thinkable that India becomes a part of the Anglosphere, not only linguistically, but culturally, that it It watches Hollywood movies or British detective series and so on, and that it starts making its own variations on the same that are culturally English or American, although the actors playing are born Indians. So that is perfectly possible, and in fact, that is what has happened many times in history, that people shed their own culture. Often people have dropped their own language, started on purpose speaking the ruling class's language, which may have been different from their own, and started speaking with their children in the language of the rulers, of the elite, in order to give their children better opportunities in life. So that they thought, you see, when the choice is between prosperity, between status on the one hand, and preserving our own language and culture, then we prefer status, success. So that has often happened, and so very many Hindus think like that. You see, this Hindi is a peasant's language. Come on, let's go for English.
Now, fascinating, right? And now, if you now I think about it this way, though, as the world gets more and more globalized and leading civilizations sort of pull away, you have children. On the one hand, take a Chinese or a Japanese kid or a South Korean kid or an American kid or a French kid who are strongly rooted in the language, culture, a strong sense of identity, and they are the ones that Indian kids are going to be competing with, but they will be the ones who will be at a sort of personal confidence, self-identity disadvantage because they have not been brought up or educated in their own culture and therefore lack that sense of self-confidence to take on those who are not similar, who are not coming from a similar situation. So would you say then that actually creates a competitive disadvantage even professionally or economically for Indians?
I think so. The Chinese, for example, are very confident in their Chineseness, even though the contents of being Chinese have changed a bit. It was Confucian and Buddhist and so on. Then it was Maoist for a while. Now the old culture is coming back to some extent. But so they speak Chinese, of course, amongst each other. And they find that knowledge of Chinese is even prized, that many American bright kids are learning Chinese.
Yes.
And so that's a completely different situation from India, where many Indian kids are turning against India and especially against Hinduism, and would not feel it a loss if every reference to it disappears. That you just don't find among the Chinese, for example.
I mean, it's fascinating that the Chinese have developed their own Facebook, their own Google, their own
very important
their own industry, their own communication. WeChat, for example, where the emphasis on building technology that people use in Chinese, communicate with each other in Chinese, and if they weren't educated in their own language, they would not even conceive of these kind of technology. So these companies are also large multi-billion-dollar companies that are in fact competing against Googles and Facebooks of the world, whereas Indians are happy being consumers of Google and Facebook, but they have not really, nobody's created a Facebook in Tamil, for example, or a Google for Gujarati, or a WeChat in Hindi, for example, right? They just get this broken whatever version, that half-assed thing that Google or Facebook comes up with, and that's basically all they live with. Okay, sorry, I think we've done a lot on this topic. Why decolonize? I'm going to again sum up with this one last question, and going to link back to the last comment I made from your book. And Dr. Elst, do you truly believe that any Indian can become truly free, can free themselves from Nehruvian secularism without educating themselves in the pre-Macaullayan system, or removing the influence of Macaulayism from their life?
Well, to remove that influence is a hard thing to do. But yeah, gradually you can make that conscious choice that you're not going to follow that cultural policy anymore. As for Nehruvian secularism, there are many upcoming intellectuals, people that I don't know personally, but whom I see on Twitter or so, who are consciously freeing themselves from that Nehruvian influence, who also say, you see, I was an automatic secularist, I didn't know better, and then since 4 years or so, I started reading the right authors, Sitaram Goel, for example, or now Raji Malhotra, for example, or Agnihotri with his Urban Naxals book and so on, seeing it from a different perspective, seeing through this Nehruvian so-called consensus, and deliberately freeing myself from it.
Absolutely.
So that is really happening. That is perfectly possible. And so if this government were to really address this on a policy level scale,
yes,
it could even go fast.
Absolutely. So then I would then say that if I interpret that correctly, no Indian can call himself or herself truly free until, for example, if you're Tamilian, if you cannot read Punyan Selvan in its original, right, and have a discussion on it, really understand it, or you read Sanskrit, if you can read Kalidasa in original and truly understand it, if you're a Bengali, Gujarati, whatever your first language is, if you cannot read the great literature of your own language in its original and think in it, be in it, immerse yourself in it, until then, you're still not free. You haven't achieved your your personal independence or freedom.
Yes, I agree. People should free themselves from that identity problem by re-establishing their own identity. You see, I don't like identity politics, neither from the left nor from the right, but precisely for that reason, it is needed to be at peace on that identity front. You see, when you deprive people of their national identity, of their cultural identity, then that becomes an issue. Then they have to fight to get it back. Now, you see, I think people have better things to do, so I prefer that they do not have to fight to get it back. Just leave it to them, or just give it to them. But you see, do not try to alienate them from their own culture. Do not impose another culture on them, as is being done still today by Nehruvian secularism.
Thank you. I think we're going to keep running over time. I know we only have 5 minutes from the scheduled time, but we'll probably run it for another 10, 15 minutes because this is such an amazing opportunity to pick Dr. Elst's brain, so I'm going to keep going. So now that we've seen what is colonization, we've seen why do we need to get rid of it, let's talk about the how. And would it be fair to say that that is one aspect in which 70 years of post-independent India has failed?
Well, let's say that it hasn't been tried. There have been attempts, for example, to translate modern culture into Hindi, to make Hindi words available for every new concept. Is that fabled, very big Hindi dictionary by Raghuvira, who for a while was the president of the Jan Sangh, the earlier incarnation of the BJP. And so, people used to make fun of that, like the famous example, Lohapat Gamini, she who runs on the iron road, that is to say the train. So instead of saying train, you would create a Sanskrit word, Lohapat Gamini, and so that would do. Now, of that, you see a lot of fun has been made, and you see that policy as a whole has not caught on, but mainly because it hasn't really been tried. Raghuvir was a strange man on the side, in the margin, and so, his ideas were not turned into policy, whereas that is perfectly possible. Let me take the example of France. They have a deliberate policy of creating French words for all new concepts that come up. And in some areas which the government can control, like the news readers, for example, they impose those words, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them do catch on. Like you have in French, le courriel for email. And so this has caught on, this is used all the time. And so if you could be a little bit more creative and more proactive with this modern use of Hindi, for example, this would catch on a lot better. Now you have the reverse tendency. In Delhi, at any rate, you notice very much, and I think now with modern media it is spreading much faster than it used to. You have this use of what they call Hinglish, where every significant word in a sentence is said in English. Even in Hindi sentences, like for instance, I heard of the death of the philosopher Ram Swarup as follows: Shri Ram Swarup dead ho gaya. You know?
Yeah.
And this happens a lot, and it can be a numeral or a color or any ordinary word can be put into English just to, because this is felt right, that a significant word should be in English.
It just feels like we are getting systematically just becoming illiterate in our own languages.
Well, that is exactly what is happening.
Yeah.
I once talked to Professor P.K. Agarwal, the son of V.S. Agarwal, who was a famous intellectual. And he said, you see, every year dozens of Hindi words are dying, are falling out of use. Because there, you see, if it's a bit of a learned term, then people think, oh, but you see, this should be in English. Hindi, that can be used to talk to the cleaning lady or the chai wala, but anything serious should be in English. And so any serious scholarly word in Hindi is falling into disuse.
Right. So continuing a thread where you said, okay, a lot of these policies have not been tried. Many people in India were hoping that with the rise of the BJP and Modi government coming into power in 2014, some of these policies would be put in place or some of these issues would be addressed. But that hasn't been the case. They have not, in fact, put education on high priority in terms of their agenda or address some of these issues. So my question to you would be, if we hope someday, if they were to appoint, say, for example, yourself as an advisor to the HRD minister in India and say, what are your top 3 recommendations to decolonize Indian education system? What would you recommend to them?
Yeah, well, as a historian, I am privy to the developments in the Indian Council of Historical Research, where I know quite a number of people. And so I know about the developments there. Now, I must say, I regret to say that there the government has not really done what it could have done. It has used the power to nominate people, not to nominate creative spirits who would influence the policies, who would, create new textbooks, who would make sure that is implemented. No, on the contrary, they are using this simply for, giving plum posts to gerontocratic RSS men as a reward for their lifelong service to the organization, but not at all with an eye on influencing policy. Often people who are not skilled in this discipline. So, so on the whole, you see, I think that the government in this respect has failed badly. It has had no active cultural policy, certainly not of restoring Hindu knowledge. For example, Kapil Kapoor and Michel Danino have a few years ago, still under Congress government, written a textbook about Indian knowledge systems, about Indian contributions to science, anciently, medievally. And so that book was put into circulation already by the UPA government. Under the BJP government, this has not been continued, let alone expanded, you see, let alone generalized.
Yeah.
And so there you see the effect has been rather negative. Now, that is a general problem of the Modi government. Many cultural issues that are really important have not been addressed, including legal issues like, for instance, the abolition of the anti-Hindu discriminations in education and in temple management. I see, for instance, the Right to Education Act enacted by the Congress Communist Coalition in 2008, is very discriminatory against Hindu schools, imposes an extra burden on them, which is not imposed on the minority schools. So you see, it would be very consequential, very effective to abolish these discriminations. I don't ask for any privileges for the Hindu community, no Hindu Rashtra or anything. No, just apply real secularism, that is, real equality regardless of religion. And that will automatically create a lot more space for Hindu education without privileging Hinduism, just allowing them the same rights as the minorities have.
Okay.
Now that this government has not done, whereas you see they could perfectly do it, many of their activists said, yeah, but you see next government, you see they need time to. Now that is not true. Many of their parliamentarians are sitting there idly. They just push the button when the party headquarters say so. Otherwise, they don't do anything meaningful. You perfectly have enough people who can, occupy themselves with this. So that the government has not been done. Maybe I like to think that it is a lack of self-confidence that they still do not dare to stand up to secularism, that even though no longer in government, still occupies the mental space, the ideological space. Perhaps if they win again, and I still say if, maybe this will be broadcast also after everybody knows the results. But so if they win again and form the government again, perhaps now they are more confident to address these issues. So I'm not I'm not pessimistic. It's just that it's about time to set to work.
Okay. So very quickly, if you were to summarize top 3 recommendations from you to the next HRD minister, what should number 1, number 2, number 3?
That depends on how ambitious you are. I mean, I think
Go big.
well, okay. Well, I think in the long run, you see, a very strong priority is the abolition of English. English should be turned. There should be a very good, solid second language course for English. You can start at like 7 years of age, and so people should become fully conversant in English. But nevertheless, they should get their main knowledge through the mother tongue. And so that is very important, very consequential. Their whole system of cultural references will change.
Okay.
So the native culture will come back up.
Okay. Number 2. You mentioned RTE, for example.
Right. The history textbooks.
Yeah.
You see, the history that people are being taught is quite influential for their whole view of the Indian situation today, of what the different religions are. And so the negative view of Hinduism is largely interiorized through this negative education, where the negative points of Hinduism, caste especially, untouchability, are being emphasized. The great things are kept out of view. The suffering that has been inflicted on Hinduism is very much kept out of view. So you see, a more truthful historical knowledge will certainly contribute to a better self-image.
Okay.
Then, as for, you said, the right to education, well, there, of course, simply equality in schools, just as equality everywhere else in society. Yeah. You see, when people are being oppressed, again, they have to spend at least mental energy or spend their time on redressing the situation, whereas I think we have, all of us have better things to do. So you see, this should be terminated as fast as possible, this injustice, and so then let everybody flourish.
Right. So I'm going to comment on 2 of them. You mentioned textbooks, history textbooks, as well as the traditional Indian science textbooks created by Dr. Kapil Kapoor and Michelle Danino. Just so you know, in Agastya Gurukulam's residential workshop that we are launching this year in the Unmesha residential program, we are hoping to use those textbooks and teach kids from those books to give them an idea of what real Indian contributions to science and technology, how they dealt where. So, and again, it, like you said, it honestly should not be our job. this should be by default into every school, but because the governments haven't taken any action, we are sort of being forced to do it ourselves. But we are a small nonprofit organization, right? Like we have very limited resources. The second thing I was going to say, though, I mean, it is fascinating to me, and again, living here in North America, it is almost unthinkable that there could be laws made in a democracy that apply differently based on the religion you're born in. It just sounds utterly ridiculous. The equality against law is a fundamental principle of any democracy in North America, like Canada or the US. If anybody would say, well, make different laws for running a school for, a Christian versus a Muslim, they would just laugh at you. It's like it is beyond the realm of the extreme right wing fringe even to even speak of that, where you can even make a law that doesn't apply equally to everybody. So why isn't the equality of equal treatment against law is a constitutional protection in the United States, for example? And it was there in the Indian Constitution as well. So why do such laws even? Where did they even come from?
Well, when the Constituent Assembly voted in favor of Article 30, which in the Constitution, which gives minorities rights to the right to set up their own schools and manage their own schools. The Constituent Assembly didn't mean to withhold these rights from the Hindus. They don't mention the Hindus because they presuppose that obviously the majority has these rights. Now, gradually later on, especially under Indira Gandhi, the interpretation of this law changed. You see, under Indira Gandhi, there was a cultural revolution going on. I mean, in China, there was a cultural revolution just at that time. India had its own cultural revolution. This was mainly because Indira Gandhi initially had to fight for her position within Congress. So she needed allies, she needed friends. So she strongly depended on the communists. And the deal with the communists was, okay, you see, you support me in the strictly political field, nominating people and so on, and I leave you the control of the cultural educational field. And so especially P.N. Haksar and Nurul Hassan, the two people she mostly depended on in this regard, they have changed the face of India. And so this cultural revolution took place, and it changed the way people were thinking about India, including therefore also the changed interpretation of these important articles of the Constitution.
Wow, amazing. I'm pretty sure most Indians do not know about this. So yes, there do exist laws in India that do not presuppose equality in front of the law. Okay, next. So then bring it back to parents and kids here and the education system here. Let's talk about the role of traditional Indian knowledge system that you touched upon briefly. How do you see their role for schools in India? And then, if we want to do it here in North America, then we would have to do it through voluntary efforts like ours. So how would you address parents of kids in India about why they should care about traditional Indian knowledge systems, and then the parents here?
Well, again, you see the question, why should you care? It's not just a question of identity. It is simply also the intrinsic value of Hindu Dharma. You see, there are a number of values that are being taught that are, well, less perfectly taught in other civilizations. And so there are a number of contrasts with present-day Western culture versus traditional Hindu culture, where I think the Hindu values, dare I utter the word, dare I say it, are superior. You see, there are points where Hindus do better. Like you have a traditional culture of non-violence. Now here, of course, critics are going to flare up and say, but what else is the Mahabharata in the history of a war? Well, yes, of course, there have been wars in Indian history, not religious wars, I mean, except later when the Muslims came. But of course, Hindu rajas have been fighting amongst each other. That is true. What I mean is, well, first of all, even those wars were as much as possible so-called just wars, especially the way the wars were conducted. It was only the fighters against each other, far more than in other places. They left the peasantry and so on untouched. But especially, there is the whole principle of nonviolence that is applied in every dimension. Like, for example, the integration of new groups in Hindu society. You see, there was a Vedic center in northwest India that gradually started to encompass all of India already long ago. Like the ancient most Tamil writings, 300 BC, already show a very thorough Vedic influence. So that happened long ago, but anyway, that happened. Now, the way that new tribes and so on were brought in was very non-violent, in the sense that there was no forced attempt to assimilate them. On the contrary, they could all keep their own identity. And so, as Dr. Ambedkar describes, this way tribes became castes. You see, what even Ambedkar recognizes about the caste system, it is a non-violent system of allowing different groups to live together, to, on the one hand, maintain their own community identity, their own group life, and on the other hand, still function together with all the other groups.
And
so rather
part
than
of a broader, bigger picture.
Right. So rather than being an excluded from, caste was also belonging to. It was a form of integration, of keeping your own group life and at the same time integrating into a larger society. So yes, that certainly had its own injustices. I'm not at all going to deny that, but that has also its positive sides. And in fact, now that you see the West is grappling with this problem of multicultural society, it could learn a few things from the Hindu tradition. And so in other respects as well, and then very especially in the crown jewel of the yoga tradition that is now catching on worldwide. You see there, of course, Hinduism has a very special merit that few other civilizations ever had.
Fascinating, and we know that, for example, even in the West, there are movements to teach kids yoga to improve their focus, concentration, even memory training and things like that. So let's speak a little bit more. I completely agree with the value for Hindu Dharma and the traditions and things like that, but sort of in a more broader education. Let's say, for example, traditional Indian math or Indian science and technology, or even things like temple architecture. What value? How do we integrate that sort of those sort of knowledge systems, and even cultural training or whatever, into the education system? And do you see that? Would you say that that provides a unique and different perspective and value to parents whose kids are going through schools today?
Yes, well, there I have to say that in terms of practical experience, I only know the standard form of education where you cram up knowledge. You see more alternative forms of schools, like my daughter has been through a Steiner school, for example. You see that is pretty different in approach, where physical skills, musical skills, and so on are far more emphasized. But I have no personal experience of this. So how to go about this, you see, that I leave to educationists. But nevertheless, what I do know about is the transmission of knowledge. And so there, far more emphasis should be laid on the contribution of the Hindu tradition to the creation of science, to the different arts. As for example, the knowledge of arts, very much is and remains unknown. We may even get a situation where the today still very alive tradition of Hindustani music and Carnatic music, of classical music, gets sidelined completely. This is the situation in China, for example, where you have a tradition of classical music, but you see, Chinese youngsters come to Brussels for the Queen Elizabeth contest of classical music, and on the violin they play Beethoven and they win. They become the best in the world. Okay, but it's not Chinese music anymore.
Right.
So in India, you still have quite a bit of that real, local, native, aboriginal culture still persisting. And so you see that ultimately is also threatened by, you see, the hunger of the elites for westernization. So there it is just very important to keep teaching that, transmit that to your children. If your daughter has a talent for music, make sure that she learns this Indian classical music and so on. So that is very important, just to keep your culture alive.
Thank you. We are 15 minutes over time, so I'm going to end with one last question. And this is, again, very relevant to everything that we talked about. And this is particularly important for us because you have written the book Agastya to Ambedkar. We named ourselves after Agastya Rishi as a source of inspiration for ourselves, and we consider Ambedkar to be one of the great heroes of India in terms of his influential ideas and everything else. So, from Agastya to Ambedkar is the name of your book.
Yes. Well, yeah, the book is a bit outdated because it's about the Aryan invasion theory and its applications. Now, in that field, you see a lot of progress has been made. So about that, I have more recent books. But the application in India concerns mainly two movements that make use of the Aryan invasion theory, namely Dravidianism.
Yes.
So there's a sort of separate South Indian culture. Now, in fact, Agastya is the Vedic Rishi who went to the south, who starts, you see, the unification of India.
Absolutely.
And then Ambedkar did not believe in the Aryan invasion theory.
Yes.
Very important. But his followers nowadays do.
Yes.
And in fact, it is like the be all and end all of their worldview. And so you see there I focused on, well, how you can perfectly discuss and conceptualize the caste situation of India without the Aryan invasion theory and all the divisive influences that come from it.
Yeah.
I see, on the contrary, you have a native Indian tradition that relativizes caste. You see that it is against this very strong compartmentalization. In fact, there to caste you can apply the same reasoning as to other so-called social evils that have historically been very heavily used by the missions, especially in order to demonize Hinduism. For instance, sati. You see, some people say, oh, sati is because of the Muslim invasions and women try to save themselves by jumping in the fire. That's not true. That also did happen, but that's not the origin of sati. Sati is already mentioned in the Rig Veda. And there it is very interesting. On the one hand, they mention the reality of sati. They mention, you see, sati existed as a custom already 4,000 years ago. Not only in India, though, by the way. But yes, it existed in India, and it is long before Islam. However, the woman there, the widow, you see, goes on the husband's funeral pyre, but then she is led away, you see. They say to her, come on, you see, this man is dead, he's going to the world of the dead, you belong to the world of the living, come on, join us. So you see that from the beginning, the attitude to sati is more complex than you see Western missionaries claimed. There was already an anti-sati attitude since the beginning.
Right.
And so similarly with caste, caste was in some circles indeed quite problematic, but it is quite possible to change that, to reform without disowning Hindu culture.
Yeah. What I was also going to point out is that Dr. Ambedkar was one of the few leaders at the time of India's independence who wanted Sanskrit to be the link language of the country. Today's Ambedkarites, they call themselves Ambedkarites, but they're anti-Sanskrit. They see that as an imposition of a Brahminical evil culture or whatever. But anyway, what I want to wrap this up with, and again, I wanted to bookend that with Agastya from Vedic Rishi times and Ambedkar, whom I consider a towering public intellectual of modern India. From these two great Indians and in this great tradition, what can we learn about decolonize? How would they inspire us to decolonize ourselves and our education?
Well, forget about decolonization. You see, as long as you talk about decolonization, you are saying that you are still in a colonized state. You see, why don't you just outgrow that right away? You know,
Yes.
it is an adolescent position of ever being in rebellion against your father. So you see, at the end of the colonial period in 1940 or so, that was understandable, no problem. But that's long ago now.
Okay.
So just return to your own culture. Forget about this Western culture. Or, return to your own culture, and any inputs that you do receive from the West, ask yourself, what would Agastya have done with this?
I don't think we can end on a better note than that. So thank you so much, Dr. Elst. For everybody who joined, thank you so much. And always ask yourself, what would Agastya have done with it? Thank you. Good night and good day.